I want to talk to you about China's Belt and Road Initiative. And the reason why I want to talk to you about that is there's been a lot of propaganda about it of late since the G7 summit. Now, mind you, China's not happy about the G7 summit, and why should it be? So the G7 focused a lot on Ukraine, right? You had these seven dwarves, as George Galloway called them on my show and other respective programs. But China's not happy about the G7 as well, because not only did Russia get slapped with more sanctions, but it was also targeted as a threat, right? And so the words economic coercion were used. Actually, the G7 itself, its joint communique, ended up being more tempered because a lot of these countries wanted to avoid decoupling. They talked about de-risking, but Rishi Sunak here angered Miss Hua Chunying, the Assistant Minister of Foreign Affairs, when he said that China poses the greatest challenge to global security and prosperity in our time at the G7 summit. So you had members talking like this. The United States tried to be more tempered, tried not to mention it like this, but economic coercion was used a lot. And China took exception to that, saying if China is a threat, said Hua, then what are the G7 members that go for wars on sovereign states, overthrow legitimate foreign governments, exit multilateral treaties, and coerce other countries to sever supply chains? So China's not happy. All right. That's the conclusion that China's not happy about what happened at the G7 summit. And why should it be? And Hua Chunying wanted to remind us, and this is really important, about where the G7 really stands. All right. So let's just say that China alone, forget the rest of the BRICS countries, as we have talked about here on this channel, but alone, China has surpassed in terms of contributions to global economic growth, has contributed more to global economic growth in the last 9 years, 2013 to 2021, than the entire G7 combined. And it's not even close. So she wanted to remind, and this is from the World Bank database, wanted to remind that this is the reality. 38.6% of global economic growth since 2013 to 2021 was China. And look at this, the US 18%, and then the rest of the G7 countries, a minuscule percentage at 25% overall. So she wanted to remind that the G7 is actually small fries, and they should not be provoking China in this way because they're not as important as they may think. And so Hua Chunying has another tweet here about just how small the G7 is. So G7 is 10% of the world's population and just 16% of the land area, while the rest of the world composes of the majority of the population, the majority of the land occupied on this earth. So in a sense, Hua Chunying is saying, you can talk all you want, but China essentially has already surpassed you alone, let alone the rest of the BRICS countries. All right. So with that said, one of the things that was shocking to me was the hubris of the European Union. I guess I should never be shocked. Ursula von der Leyen was there at the G7 summit, right? So 7 dwarves plus a few, right? So you had the G7 country leaders, and you also had Zelensky and Ursula there. So you had kind of a bigger crowd than what is, what you would normally see. And that's because of this unity that they're trying to put on in the face of the Ukraine conflict. But here you have Ursula and the EU talking about being in a race to the top with China. And she says that the bloc needs to outcompete Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative. She said this at the G7 summit, that many countries of the global south are looking for alternative funding options. She said that their bad experiences with China are seeking them to want to look toward us. So it's this extraordinary projection, right? They took Chinese loans and ended up in a debt crisis. So she's repeating all of this. I mean, it's false. I'm going to show you all the reasons why it's false. All this false propaganda, only to say that the EU needs to compete. Well, the G7 has done this in the past. The G7 announced this initiative last year saying, we're going to compete with China. We're going to invest all this money. Nothing ever came of it. Build Back Better World, all of these things. Nothing has ever come out of these pledges. But nonetheless, the EU, Ursula von der Leyen, EU Commission president, is saying that they need to compete. And why do they need to compete? Oh, because the poor global south is looking toward us. That's what she's saying. This is incredible hubris. And what she's repeating are these smears, and these smears have come hot and heavy in recent weeks. Here is an article in Fortune magazine. Thank you so much. I believe it was Fahim who sent this to me on Patreon. I'm not going to be able to read this whole article, but I wanted to show you that this is what you see all across. This is from the Associated Press, being reposted in Fortune. In a lot of the world, the clock has hit midnight. China is calling in loans to dozens of countries from Pakistan to Kenya. And so they describe, right, these countries in the global south, Pakistan, Kenya, which have taken out loans supposedly from China for them to build infrastructure. And now China is saying, well, you've defaulted. You are now going to have this money stripped from you, and you're going to be left in the dark. And now you're in a debt crisis because we're not going to pay off. We're not going to forgive the debt, and we're also not going to build the projects. You heard, right, in the last few years, like Uganda, Sri Lanka, these examples where it's like debt trap diplomacy. China promised to build an airport. Now it's not going to because the countries aren't paying their debt back. This is the narrative that's being spun, and Ursula von der Leyen is trying to say that this is fact. Well, I got to say, it is not fact. It is the opposite of fact. The truth is that both mainstream sources and independent journalists have confirmed, and also state, if you want to say state-affiliated media, right? If you want to say Russian media, Chinese media, they've all said the same thing. I'm going to show you all the things they've said, and then I'm going to talk to you about what the Belt and Road Initiative actually is. So I'm just going to go over a few of these examples with you. For one, you have the Chatham House. So for those of you who don't know what the Chatham House is, this is not what I would call a progressive institution. All right, let's just go quickly to their funding. All right, so their funding, okay, here they're not telling you who their funding is, but let's see if we can go to the donors. So their donors here, okay, here's a list. Let's go look at their donors. Can you see this? Yes, you can. All right. So their donors here, another foundation, the UK, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office in the UK, the European Commission, MacArthur, the US Department of State, okay, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. You get the picture, right? This is not a progressive institution. But let's go back to the article. So even they are saying this is an institution that's not on the side of China or Russia. This is a full throttle US funded, UK funded, Western backed think tank. You had Hillary Clinton cackling at this think tank, right? Promoting neocon war propaganda about everything. Speaking here, this is a mainstream Western establishment think tank. And they're saying that you can debunk the myth of debt trap diplomacy, how recipient countries shape China's Belt and Road Initiative. Critics of BRI accuse China of pursuing a debt trap diplomacy, luring poor developing countries into agreeing to unsustainable loans to pursue infrastructure projects so that when things become financially difficult, Beijing can seize the asset, thereby extending its strategic and military reach. This paper demonstrates that the evidence for such views is limited. So I'm not going to read the whole thing here because it is quite a long, but they do give I'm just going to head over to the conclusion. So they do give examples, but I'm also going to get into a shorter article that gives those details. But what they say is mainstream accounts depict China's BRI as a predatory form of economic statecraft to ensnare poor countries for geopolitical ends, and that this paper demonstrated that the BRI is in fact motivated largely by economic factors. It has shown that China's poorly coordinated and fragmented international development financing system is not geared toward advancing geopolitical aims. In addition, recipient countries are not hapless victims, but actively shape outcomes with China's development financing system. Accordingly, the BRI does not follow a top-down plan, but emerges piecemeal through diverse bilateral interactions, with outcomes being shaped by interests, agendas, and governance problems on both sides. So there you have it. They conclude, even though they do try to get in a little jab at China there, what they're really saying is that diverse bilateral activities, what that means is that BRI countries have a huge say in what happens with the BRI. And that oftentimes, and this is true with Sri Lanka at the Humboldt port, that these projects oftentimes don't happen because the countries just can't get them done together. And oftentimes China is forgiving loans. I mean, China forgave 19 African countries as loans a couple of years ago during the COVID-19 pandemic. And Uganda denied reports that China seized an airport back because it couldn't pay loans. All of these have been proven to be lies, but to Ursula, they are truth, right? So I'm going to go over this debt trap diplomacy myth with you quickly. Amanda Yee has been on this show. She wrote a great article on the Real News Network about this, okay? And she writes, why Chinese debt trap diplomacy is a lie. The Western narrative about Chinese diplomacy is designed to distract from the IMF and World Bank's own practice of pushing predatory loans with extraordinarily high interest rates on countries in the global south. So, U.S. politicians and corporate media often promote the narrative that China lures developing countries into predatory high-interest loans to build infrastructure projects as part of its Belt and Road Initiative. As the story goes, China anticipates that the borrowing country will default on that loan so that it can seize that asset in order to extend its military or geostrategic influence, evidence that China is colonizing the global south. So this debt trap diplomacy narrative finds its origins in a 2017 article published in a think tank in northern India's describing China's financing of Sri Lanka's Hambantota port. The concept was then picked up by two Harvard graduates in 2018 when they published a paper accusing China of debt book diplomacy, leveraging accumulated debt to achieve strategic aims. This paper was then widely cited by media publications. The idea of Chinese debt traps seeped into Washington in intelligence circles, and a short time later, in November 2018, a Google search of the phrase debt trap diplomacy generated nearly 2 million results. So it was a coordinated campaign of propaganda. By now, debt trap diplomacy accusation has become a bipartisan one. So you have Trump and Biden. You also have BBC News, even editing an interview with Deborah Brottingam, a scholar known for her work challenging the validity of this debt trap diplomacy myth, to only include her explanation of the myth itself, omitting all evidence she cited against it, leading listeners to believe that Brottingam was in fact claiming the concept was true. So here are the problems with it. The first problem with the myth is that it assumes China unilaterally dictates the Belt and Road Initiative and lures other countries into taking on predatory loans. In reality, Chinese development financing is largely recipient-driven through bilateral interactions and deals. That's what the Chatham House was saying, the neocon establishment think tank. All right, infrastructure projects are determined by the recipient country, not China, based on their own economic interests and political interests. The second problem is that it relies on the assumption that Chinese policy to advance predatory loans that it is a Chinese policy to advance predatory loans in onerous terms and conditions to ensnare countries into debt. In reality, China often advances loans at fairly low interest rates and is often willing to restructure the terms of existing loans to be more favorable to the borrowing country or even forgive them altogether. In fact, in August of 2022, the Chinese government announced it was forgiving 23 interest-free loans for 17 African countries. Prior to that, in 2000 to 2019, China also restructured a total of $15 billion of debt and forgiven about $3.4 billion in loans given to African countries. And lastly, the third problem with this debt trap diplomacy narrative is that despite what it claims, China has never seized an asset because a country has defaulted on its loan. And then she goes into the Sri Lanka example, where basically Sri Lanka was having many of its own internal problems, could not honestly finance the project, decided to actually give it back to China in terms of ownership structure. And the port was actually built, okay, but in fact, it needed more Chinese assistance. And so then there was the Uganda example. I don't even have to go over that. And then she goes over the real debt trap, okay, where you have the IMF and the World Bank who actually pursue liberalization of economies, the destruction of public infrastructure, etc. So the point here is, and I'm going to show you two examples of what the Belt and Road Initiative actually does, and then I will get into what the Belt and Road Initiative is. But the point here is that this is all a lie. And so Ursula von der Leyen is literally not telling the truth. That actually the Belt and Road Initiative And China's role in global economic development is far more important than the G7 and far more important than the European Union at this point. So all of this is projection, saying that the global south is looking for alternatives. No, they're looking for alternatives from you. They're watching your pathetic and absolutely dogged servility to the United States and how you've allowed weaponized sanctions and the weaponized dollar to not only just obliterate European industry and the value of the euro, but also to really create instability in the global economy. That's what global South countries are looking at, and they're saying, get me out of this. And the Belt and Road Initiative is a great alternative. It is actually a good alternative. There is not going to be an alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative because the United States and the EU, especially, cannot compete. And so I'm going to show you another example of this. So a lot has been made recently of Laos. So Laos is a small country, another socialist country, mind you. It is a socialist government. It considers itself a socialist government. And Laos was absolutely pummeled by US bombing during the Vietnam War period. Laos was hit with incredible number of bombs. It was invaded. There are still landmines being detonated everywhere. But RT had this to say that the U.S. bombed Laos into oblivion is now trying to scare it away from China. Claims that the Belt and Road Initiative could create a new epidemic are a bizarre new line in a bizarre new line of attack on Beijing's efforts in the country. And so this is from Timur Fomenko, a political analyst over there who actually writes very decent articles. You should check out his articles over there on these issues. And I think they do a really good job here. So Laos, they say, is a landlocked communist state in Southeast Asia, wedged between China, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Myanmar. It has the potential to be a kind of nexus of sorts for the entire region, and its cooperation with Beijing is now under fire in the West. So this is a poor country, and it was pummeled with over 2 million tons of bombs during the Vietnam War, and it's still facing the consequences of this, including deaths from unexploded munitions, and it has leaned on China for assistance. In recent years, Laos has benefited considerably from the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. In late 2021, the China-Laos high-speed railway was built, connecting the country's capital to Beijing. This has been a game changer in foreign trade and exports. Currently, a new superhighway is also being built across the country. And last week, we saw an article from Reuters, which attracted widespread disdain on social media as it sought to frame China's development in the country as risking a new pandemic. It was titled China, Birthplace of the COVID Pandemic, is now laying tracks for another global health crisis. And so the point here is that the Reuters was trying to make the case that building a highway through the country's tropical forests will bring humans closer in contact with bats, and that this will lead to the potential for a new pandemic. And this isn't the first time that the United States has said that China's infrastructure, Nicaragua, there's a canal that they have been building in Nicaragua, and that was smeared by the United States as well as supposedly against the indigenous people, and it was going to destroy, the natural world and the environment. And all of it was to try to get Nicaragua to abandon the canal project so that it would remain a poor country. This is what is actually afoot here. So the Western media have it in for China's relationship with Laos, denouncing Chinese investments as a debt trap and accusing Laos of being a vassal state. Why? Because Laos is the single most pro-China country in Southeast Asia, a region which is being targeted by the U.S. in its Indo-Pacific strategy. Despite being communist, Washington sees Vietnam as a potential ally and military and economic counterweight to Beijing, although I think that is a miscalculation. And that Laos is a landlocked state, which reduces U.S. geopolitical leverage against China. So, in a sense, though, what this author doesn't recognize or doesn't mention is that in building the Sino-Lao Railway, the China-Lao Railway, China actually demined a lot of these bombs and helped Laos do so. So to think that a country like Laos, which has been bombed into oblivion and bombed into impoverishment by the United States, would see the EU, a vassal of the United States, and the G7 in general, as an alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative is laughable because it's China's infrastructure development assistance, which is helping this country gain access to ports and markets and to connect it with other countries in the region. Thailand is also getting a high-speed railway. Brian Berletic has been on the show to talk about that. And this is helping them overcome obstacles. And so this concerted effort is that, so it's just one example of this concerted effort to smear the Belt and Road Initiative. It's all over the place, but the benefits of the BRI cannot be denied. And there's no outcompeting it. The Europe and the United States, show me the money, right? Show me the investment. It's not happening. And there are many good reasons why that is. But one last thing that I want to show here is this China Central Asia Summit recently happened with the C5 countries. Okay. So these countries, right? Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan. Which one am I forgetting? Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. These countries, right? These Central Asian countries came together and they held a summit, and they established what has always been true, is that Central Asia is a hub for the Belt and Road Initiative. It's a hub for the Belt and Road Initiative. Let's get that straight. Without Central Asia, the Belt and Road Initiative would not be operable, especially in its land route. But the Central Asian countries came together during the same time that the G7 was coming together, and they not only reviewed their progress, but also inked deals and charted a course for further integration of the entire region. Despite all the U.S. efforts to say, Russia and China are at odds with each other over Central Asia, they were trying to divide them. They were trying to say so many things about this, right? And ultimately, it was a failure. This ended up in a wild success. And here are just some of the numbers I want to show you. So China-Europe freight trains, 80% by the end of 2022, 80% of freight train service was going through Central Asia from China, 65,000 trips. Gas and crude oil, you had China Central Asia gas pipeline, total of 10,000 kilometers, delivering 423.2 billion cubic meters of natural gas to China by the end of 2022. So you have tunnels being built. You have the Uzbekistan Kamchik tunnel of the Agilian Papu Railway in Uzbekistan, which is the longest tunnel in Central Asia, built in 900 days by China, 900 seconds to travel through the mountains by train. So this is huge developments because Uzbekistan is a mountainous region, just like a lot of Central Asia. They don't call it the Caucasus regions for nothing. These are mountainous countries. And so that's what China is doing. In 900 days, that was built. The China-built Tajikistan-Uzbekistan highway is 355 kilometers long, and it connects the capital of Tajikistan to Uzbekistan. And then you have the Tajikistan-Kyrgyzstan highway, the international highway between Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and China. And it's an important component of the China Central Asia West Asia economic corridor. So the cooperation is very real. And tell me when the last time you heard the G7 countries building superhighways and key and critical infrastructure for countries like this. Last time I checked in 2020, what was happening to Kazakhstan? What was happening? There were protests being backed by the United States. The National Endowment for Democracy was backing protests in Kazakhstan, causing instability. And then in March, what did they do? Antony Blinken was in these countries, going to Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. He went to Uzbekistan. He went to these countries and basically lectured them on what they should be doing. Okay. He said that they should be aligning with Turkmenistan. I keep forgetting Turkmenistan, but they should be aligning with the United States over Russia and China. Does that sound like a fair deal? Does that sound like a competitive deal? Because the United States didn't offer anything in the way of robust economic assistance. You're not going to find you. Is there a project anywhere in the world? Tell me that project where the United States and these G7 countries are sending their workers, are sending their companies, like legitimately sending that, not just planting and usurping and leeching and predatorily robbing countries, but I'm saying sending your best to these countries and saying, we will help you build this together. Tell me, where is that project? Because I don't know. It's not the Peace Corps. It's not any. Tell me. No, there's none, because there's no outcompeting, because they don't want to. So that's important to note. China has already surpassed the G7. China has destroyed any notion that there is competition, right, with the Belt and Road Initiative. No, the Belt and Road Initiative is huge. It is here to stay, and countries are going to choose it. Countries are going to choose. Here's what I'm going to show you, just a review. Silk Road Briefing does a good job summarizing what it is. What is it? A $4 trillion investment spent for supply chains through road, rail, ports, and supporting infrastructure, like the Sino-Lao Railway, right? Like these highways being built in Central Asia. What is the purpose of BRI? To secure trade and supply chains for China and to create prosperity via trade in less well-off and secure nations. What is the Belt and Road Initiative's policy? Peace via trade to ensure supply chain connectivity. And here's what it looks like. Here is the map, okay? So Xi'an, that's where I've been there. Xi'an's a beautiful city, one of my favorite places I went to in China. And I got to say, it's beautiful. It's the hub of the Silk Road. It starts in Xi'an, okay? And the land route goes to Urumqi, which is the capital of Xinjiang. Well, do you get why there's so much human rights atrocity propaganda about Xinjiang? It's because of this. And then you end up in the Central Asia region, you see? And that's why it's so important for them to be connecting to Iran, right? Then connecting to Turkey, and then into Europe. That's the China, Central Asia to Europe freight system. And then you have the maritime belt, okay? You see these coastal cities playing a key role in China, Vietnam being a part of this, Indonesia being a part of this, and you have this interconnectivity happening to Africa all the way to Europe as well. So that's what the Belt and Road Initiative is supposed to look like. And this is a huge project. Okay, it started in 2013, and what is its current status? 147 countries, $4 trillion of investments, and thousands of projects. Pakistan being a huge part of this with the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And it goes on and on and on. China-Russia strategic partnership. While Russia is not necessarily a formal BRI partner, it has a very similar integration project. So the point of all of this is that BRI is here to stay. Belt and Road Initiative is here to stay. This is fool's gold. It is absolutely wrong. It is wrong for them to say they're going to outcompete. Why doesn't the EU just join the Belt and Road Initiative? It only so happens that these countries are literally connecting themselves to the European landmass so that the interconnectivity and trade is robust, and so that these poor countries can no longer be poor. Why doesn't the EU join? Well, it can't, because it's a U.S. vassal, and it is now being impoverished by the same forces that it is that are fighting this, right? That are fighting the Belt and Road Initiative. It is being impoverished by the United States. And so that's where we're at. There's going to be no outcompeting. The G7 is history. The G7 is small. The G7 is shrinking. The United States, it's a shrinking economy as well. There's all this, oh, we're still the biggest economy. No, you're a shrinking economy. So is the European Union country, shrinking economies. It's only getting worse. But China is not a shrinking economy, and the Belt and Road Initiative is not a shrinking initiative. It is one that is very attractive. What is not attractive about public infrastructure, more jobs? The World Bank talks about how it's key in developing infrastructure and reducing extreme poverty. What is not to be enthusiastic about? And that, I think, can be summarized. All of this can be summarized in this headline. I'm not going to be able to read the article, but this headline here, this is in the Financial Times. The G7 must accept that it cannot run the world. American hegemony and the group's economic dominance are now history. Mr. Martin Wolf, writing for the Financial Times of all places, I could not have said it better myself. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.